Very hearty good evening to all. We have about 90 participants in this very lucrative title of today's. So Center of Excellence in Safety Engineering and Analytics, IIT Kharagpur welcomes all the participants to the 16th Weekend Talk on Safety Engineering Management and Analytics. This program is conducted under Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, commemorating 75 years of India's independence. This is a campaign by the Government of India. Yes, Sanjana? So, Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya. With this wonderful shloka, which leads us from ignorance to the truth, from darkness to the light, and from death to immortality, we initiate our session with this shloka today. With this, myself, Mom Mitra from Tata Steel, with our research scholars, Sanjana, Ashish, and Shovik, we welcome you to this Weekend Talk series. There is an announcement. We have an international conference on maintenance and intelligent asset management. So, ladies and gentlemen, please note the dates. The dates are 12th to 15th of December 2021, and all are requested to submit the abstracts. The deadline is 24th of September 2021. I repeat, the deadline is 24th of September 2021. Notification of abstract acceptance will be given by 30th September. Paper submission deadline is 22nd October. And notification of paper acceptance will be given by 30th October 2020. All are requested to submit more and more abstracts. So now I welcome the dignitaries to the virtual dais. We have Professor J. Maiti, our chairman of COE SEA, Professor Obi Krishna, a convener of the Weekend Talk series, and Professor Rajagopalan Srinivasan, our expert speaker of today. Mr. Rajagopalan Srinivasan is a professor of chemical engineering and the head of American Express Lab for Data Analytics, Risk and Technology at IIT Madras. He received his BTech from IIT Madras and PhD from Purdue University. He was a researcher at Honeywell Technological Center, Minneapolis, before joining the National University of Singapore as faculty. In 2013, he moved to IIT Gandhinagar, where he established the Center of Safety Engineering, Safety and Sustainability, are the key themes of his research program, which is targeted towards developing systems engineering approaches for the design and resilient operation complex systems. He has authored and co-authored over 440 international journal and conference papers, and he is a consultant to DRDO, Department of Atomic Energy, and over 20 well-known companies such as ABB, ExxonMobil, Honeywell, and Shell. He was recognized as the Elsevier Journal Chemicals and Chemical Engineering as one of the most prolific authors in the history of the journal. He has received the Best Paper Awards for several journals and conferences. He is also an associate editor of several premier journals, including Process Safety, Environment Protection, Frontiers in the Energy Research. He is also on the editorial board of over 20 journals. So his teaching has been recognized by the NUS through a gold medal for innovative teaching and internationally by the Award of Merit from the Association of Media Technology in Education in Canada. And I think the audience is really blessed with the topic of engineering human performance in the workplace, cognitive approaches for measuring, modeling, monitoring, and shaping people's behavior. So I now request Professor Maiti to formally welcome our expert speaker of the evening.
Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Professor Rajagopalan Srinivasan. I will not tell any background about Professor Rajagopalan. Already, Mom has explained so nicely, and you have seen the illustrious career as well as so many things to be talked about him. So I just only tell the audience that yes, we are extremely privileged to have Professor Rajagopalan today, and his topic is engineering human performance in the workplace. In fact, a topic I think of every time importance. If we start from the Heinrich that research in 1930 or 1920s till today, every time we basically see that the human element is one of the key element in the safety management and safety improvement, as well as in terms of improving the engineering safety point of view. And you will be learning that a lot today from the cognitive or mental process, what actually the mental ability and how they cope up with the situations and how to measure all those key aspects, which basically Professor Rajagopalan will be explaining to you. In addition, the that how the behavior or the performance shaping factors related to behavior. Professor Rajagopalan Srinivasan, you have actually a topic, you have chosen given us a topic which we are looking for maybe for the last since we started this particular program that okay, we want some talk in this line. We are extremely thankful to you, and you know about our center, and we welcome you to this weekend talk. Now the stage is yours, Professor Rajagopalan Srinivasan. Thank you, Professor Raja.
Thank you, Professor Maiti, for those kind words. Thank you also, Ms. Mom Mitra, for that introduction. First of all, I would like to first of all congratulate IIT Gandhinagar, particularly Professor Maiti and Professor Gopi Krishna for setting up this Center of Excellence. Safety, like we were discussing a few minutes ago, is an area where the needs are large. We are, in a sense, at least in the Indian context, in my opinion, we are still in the early stages of developing the capability that the nation needs. And I really congratulate IIT Kharagpur for taking up an initiative to set up such a large, significant, impactful activity. I really, look forward to working with you and your team also in the future to ensure that safety becomes the norm in our nation. So with that, let me share my screen. I'm going to put it on slideshow. Can you already see my PowerPoint window?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to put it on slideshow. So I will probably not be able to see much of the audience. So if at any point if you'd like to say something, please do. I'll try to pause. So this is a title of my presentation. We're going to be talking about people. Like Professor Maiti said, all of us know people play a huge role in safety, not just in the chemical industry, which is where I have been trained in and some of my research has been, but in almost any industry. The focus on humans in the safety arena started in the late 1600s and 1700s. So we are close to 400 years of knowing that people have a role to play in the safety world. But what I want to really convey to you is not that it has this glorious history. What I want to say is that as times pass, as we now enter as we are in this 21st century, the nature of the job, nature of the expectations from people are changing. In many industries, what we are asking people to do is very different from what they were doing even 15 years ago. And therefore, the role, just that the role changes, the expectations in terms of maintaining safety also has to change. And let's see now, during this next 45, 50 minutes, what these changes are. Why are these changes really important to the safety avenue? And what can we do as researchers and then technologists to enable better safety? So that's roughly what I'm trying to convey to you during today's talk. So I want to start the beginning, first of all, by acknowledging the people who have been on my side as we have walked this journey. This is also, I've been an academic for now nearly well over 25 years. These are the people who have really made it possible for me to share with you what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, my colleagues, Professor Babji Srinivasan, who is a professor in the Applied Mechanics Department in IIT Madras. He was earlier with IIT Gandhinagar. Professor Niket Kaisare in IIT Madras, and then also one of my esteemed collaborators from my Singapore days, Professor Martin Heland. And then any research, like I think many of my faculty colleagues here in this avenue would agree that even though we call them students and scholars, they really are the teachers, because they are the ones who really figure out how to solve the problem and then teach us their supervisors. So the number of students who have been part of this journey, I didn't have the space to list all of them. What I've done is highlighted the few who have made direct impact to the things that I'm going to be talking about today. the ones which are the names which are highlighted. So Umair, Rahul, Parag, Atif, and Tasnimol, they are all working on the kind of things that on the precise things that we will talk about today. These are masters, PhD students, mostly PhD students, but also we have almost an army of undergraduate students who have been involved in our research, especially in the last 7-8 years. The army currently comprises of Bharat, Harshit, Neeraj, Pranav, Santosh, and Shah, but there are probably at least 30 other names I should really list, and so on. Now, as a researcher, obviously, you need access to ideas, which is your colleagues and students, but you also need other financial and data kind of support. We have been very fortunate to get support from A*STAR, Department of Atomic Energy, Department of Defense in India, Department of Science and Technology, and a number of other institutions that I will not read out today. And we have been, again, very fortunate to get support from industry, both financial and technical data and so on. And so the lessons that I'm going to be sharing with you today really is the blessings that we have from all these people listed from on the slide. So with that, let me jump into what I want to share with you today. I want to motivate this talk with a recent survey done by this company called McKinsey. I'm sure all of you know. This is a survey which was done in June of this year. And it basically places the spotlight on where we are today as around the world. We are in the midst of a pandemic. We could be in a mid stage, we could be in a late stage, we could still be seeing a few surprises, we don't know. But what is clear is that around the world, in many places, economy shut down for a while. People were working remotely predominantly, and then starting maybe early part of this year, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, people were asked to come back to work and do things. So this survey basically focuses on those people who have returned to work. And they asked them a few questions. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. One is this coming back to work. They asked them, is this having a positive impact on their mental health, or is it having a negative impact on their mental health? And what the survey shows, and the link at the bottom will give you the full study, the survey shows that more people indicate that it has had a major negative impact on their mental health. Many people report feelings of anxiety, depression, distress, and so on. It applies both to males and females. It depends on a variety of demographic factors, but the truth is that we are now in a situation where humans are under stress in today's September 2021 kind of situation. That's point one. The second point, and this is kind of slightly a higher, wider panoramic view. We know around the world that we are undergoing several major transitions. If you pick up the newspaper, it's very likely that you're going to read something about climate change, especially extreme weather. We are seeing it in India as well as many countries around the world. We hear about cybersecurity. IT, computers are the norm in anything we do today, and cybersecurity therefore impacts all of us. We hear about a digital transformation industry that also places somewhat of a stress on how people behave, because the work practices are now changing based on this analytics and the digital sources of information which are impinging on what people do. The norms on how you engage hire people are changing. That's called the future of work. There are a lot more people working in what's called the gig economy. That again leaves an impact on their frame of mind. And then this last point is perhaps little less critical in India. It's more so in many major developed economies. There's a demographic shift. The number of aged people are much higher. Number of youngsters who can work in industry, in the factory floor, or even go to school, etc. That number is dropping, and that has also an impact on work. All of this would look like we just picked 2021 to be a bad time in humans development. Maybe this is unusual. Maybe this is not the norm, and many people hope perhaps that these bad times will go away. But that is increasingly almost widespread acceptance that this is not unusual. That there is no going back on many of the factors which we have listed here. This is not going back to a new normal. We are probably going to something that some people call very cleverly, in my opinion, as never normal. So what is this never normal? Never normal means that the state that we live in today, where there's a lot of volatility in all the things that I mentioned about, this volatility is probably going to be the norm. So not having a normality is going to be the new normal. And this we see this in industry, in variety of industries. In fact, we see it in energy. In our country, we are shifting away from coal. We are trying to get into more and more renewables, wind, solar, and so on. And the expectation is that greener fuels like hydrogen, etc., will become increasingly important, taking over the majority by 2050, but maybe even having a significant impact closer around 2030 or so. We are seeing major shifts in healthcare, how we take care of people. We are seeing major shifts in food, agriculture. And over the last year and a half, consumer behavior has changed, how we shop, what we shop for, how we, decide, etc. All that is changing. The capacities and resources available for manufacturing are changing. They are shifting. Perhaps, many companies are saying, let's make things at home rather than import some semi-produced product from halfway around the world. Work dynamics are changing. And obviously, like I mentioned earlier, there are technological waves in the background which are sometimes enabling this, and sometimes they are just there. Big data, mobile, cloud, etc. All of those are those technological developments. Business models are changing, as I showed there. And therefore, the question is, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with this situation where there is never a sense of steady state? And again, industry would say, let's become agile, let's become resilient. So what does becoming agile mean? Let me share an example. This is a project that we really worked on with a company. I will not name names here. This is a company is in the business of making petroleum products. And those of you who are somewhat familiar with this, you know that these companies are supposed to be continuous plants using the same raw material for many days, maybe many weeks at a time. Raw material quality should not change. The product slate also should not change, and the plant therefore is supposed to operate in some kind of steady state. When we started working with them, what we found was these factors that I talked about earlier is in fact breaking the way that they used to work. So I have just taken data from some portion of the plant, and we analyzed this data using various data analytics techniques. I will not get into the details there. What we found was that during a 4-month period that we got the data from, there were 22 significant periods that I call here as transitions, where the plant was nowhere near any kind of a steady state. Remember that these kind of plants really make money, turn a profit only when they are at steady state, making a quality product which the market demands. When these transitions happen, the plants are either not making profit or occasionally even losing money. So having these 22 transitions over a 4-month period, when they were undergoing major shifts, is really something that's their response to changing market conditions, this volatility we talked about, but it also means that they are doing something that they really are not wired for. Certainly the automation systems that they have in place are not wired for operating this way. So let me explain what I mean by that when I say that the automation system is not wired. So you notice these on this table on the right, I have highlighted a start mode, end mode. Let's just take any one of them. So let's say the start mode being number 2, going to a mode that I call as 3. So 2 and 3 are steady states. We are talking about the transition from 2 to 3 over on a number of occasions over this 4-month period. What I want to highlight here is just one point. On certain days during this 4 months, they could do this shift within 30 minutes. But the same shift from starting mode 2 to starting mode 3, there were occasions where they could take as much as 5 hours. So they were not making profit, perhaps even incurring a loss for 5 hours, while it is possible for the same plant using the same resources to have done it in half hour. So that is 4.5 hours of money which has been lost, right? This is what I mean by agility and the inability of our current automation systems to handle agility. If you sum it all together, what we found was that at least 2.5% of the operating time could have been eliminated from a period of agility, from a period of shifts, transitions, and the plant could have achieved exactly the same end goal with far less money giveaway, far less impact on the bottom line. Why was that not happening? Because each of these transitions require people to do certain things at the right time and with the right piece of equipment. So people, in a sense, are running the plant, but there are so many occasions where they just are not able to do it well enough. So this is from an efficiency point of view. We have known, so bottom line, the lost opportunity, depending on how we price it, was at least 10 million, perhaps up to 50 million over a 4-month period. So you do the math. We have known for a long time that people have an impact on plant safety. I don't need to tell you anything about it. I just want to give you an example to say how we have historically, 100 years ago, thought about it. So this is a picture that many of you who are experts or who are students of process safety would have seen in the past. This is a man, operator, in a plant making dynamite, in fact, explosive. The reaction is carried out in this vessel that you see this person sitting in front of. This reaction is extremely temperature sensitive. Temperature has to be maintained to be below a certain threshold. If temperature exceeds that, the reaction will run away. For those of you who are not chemical engineers, that basically means this whole thing will blow up. Obviously, the person will die, but not just this person, the entire factory will be razed to the ground. So in those days, before there was the state-of-the-art automation, sensing technology that we take for granted today, the way control was done was manually, and that's the reason the person you see is there in the picture. The sensor is the palm of his hand. The person resting his hand on the reactor knows what the temperature, and if it feels too hot, he's supposed to open a valve right here in the top to ensure that the coolant increases and therefore the temperature comes down. Now, in this plant, obviously, ensuring safety means this person has to be active, taking the temperature reading and then be ready at any instant to operate the valve. The biggest crime that this person could commit is fall asleep and not pay attention to the temperature or any temperature spikes. So the owner of this factory designed a very special furniture to ensure that this operator stays awake. I presume all of you can see it on the bottom left of the screen. You see what's called a single-legged stool. The basic idea that the owner had was that if this person falls asleep, he will fall down, wake himself up, and get back to do his job. In a sense, feedback control on the human. We probably don't use a single-legged stool too much in our modern working days. I have recommended in many institutions that maybe our lecture theaters really require some of similar furniture, but not many people have come forward to take that suggestion. And we probably don't certainly need that in industrial settings today, because companies do not control their plants or safety critical operations in this fashion anymore. What they do is perhaps something more like what you see on the right side of the screen. It's all computerized. You have neat, nice, modern control rooms. Data from around the plant comes in, and there are people sitting in the comfort of an air-conditioned room, observing the plant and taking control actions through the computer to, again, but still ensuring the same thing, ensuring safety. And this is not the only intervention that people make. In the chemical industry, for example, we talk about process safety management. A number of things are done in addition to having people sitting in front of the computers and running the plant. We do a number of things to ensure safety. I probably don't have the time now to walk through the role of people in each of these layers of this pyramid here. All I want to pass on to you is this one single message that if you think through this carefully, in each of these layers, you will find that even though at the surface it looks like automation or something else is playing a major role, it in fact is a human who at the end of the day ensures safety. I will give you a few examples about that in a minute. But at the surface, you would know, all of us would know that most major accidents trace their root cause back to some kind of human error. Here I've given you examples from the chemical industry, but also from nuclear power plants, from shipping, and a variety of other industries. But what we find traditionally, people coming to this conclusion that human error is the largest contributor to industrial accidents today. And we put in sophisticated technology to ensure that people probably don't make mistakes. We talk about digital transformation. We say, let's give people a digital twin, something which takes the data, organizes in a particular form, and provides information in the right packaged form so that people know exactly what the plant is doing, even though I may or may not have a sensor which gives me all the critical results, right? But we also know, for example, that when extreme weather or climate change happens, we don't rely on automation to make sure that our plants don't catch fire. In fact, what I have here on the right side of the screen is a pamphlet. They call it a pamphlet, basically a recommendation from the Center for Chemical Process Safety and Industry Association in the chemical industry on how to deal with climate change and extreme weather. And you look at all the recommendations they given, every one of them involves a person taking responsibility for one aspect of ensuring plant safety in the case of extreme weather. So putting the focus primarily on human, the relations with the technology, with each other, the systems and procedures they have in place, and the culture in the company. So humans again. We talked about demographic shifts. I will not spend much time talking about it. We fortunately are not yet at a stage in our country here in India where this is a major issue. But around the world, and especially in the Western developed countries, this is a major issue. And what we know is that when we have operators who are very senior, close to retirement, we would expect that their cognitive and physical capabilities will decline, and therefore the ability to do things will be compromised. But also, they have obviously younger operators and younger engineers in their plant. But the fact that they do not have as much experience as these senior operators means neither the senior operators nor the new younger junior operators are in a great shape to tackle the challenges that I have talked about. Let me give you a couple of examples to kind of make these concepts very, very clear. This is an accident which happened in a plane flying from Brazil, Rio de Janeiro to be very precise, flying back to Paris. It was the Air France flight. Plane takes off, all is normal. It suddenly runs into rough weather. If the pilots had done nothing and left things as is, this plane would have landed with no problem in Charles de Gaulle Airport in France. What happened was due to certain cognitive overload. I will talk to that in a minute. The pilots did that one thing that they should not have done. And that led to this plane falling off the sky. This accident happened right in the middle of the South Atlantic Sea. The plane was found 3 kilometers below the surface, so 3,000 meters below the surface. Black box was retrieved 3 years after the accident. From whatever they could find out from the black box, accident investigation basically revealed something very simple. There is an instrument called the pitot tube, which measures air speed. This air speed is an important variable measurement for the autopilot to fly the plane. All that had happened on this case was when the plane flew into the bad weather, the temperature dropped significantly and the pitot tube got frozen, meaning that it was not giving the values of the air speed as it should. Without the availability of this one measurement, the plane's autopilot stopped working and the plane basically had to be flown by the pilots. In this particular case, this event happened at 2:10 a.m. 4 minutes later, at 2:14, the plane crashed into the sea, and like I said, really bad things happened. So the pilots did something which within 4 minutes led to the plane crashing, in a sense getting into what's called by aviation experts as a stall, aeronautical stall. And primarily, basically, it means that the operators, in this case the pilots, did the one thing that they should not have. They pulled the nose of the plane up, trying to climb over the bad weather. But because the air density was very low, they ended up getting themselves into a storm. Right? So if you look at it like this, and look at the fact that 70–80% of accidents today, in fact, trace their origin to the human, one would say that the human is, in fact, playing the role of a villain. Right? In many systems, we should just try to get rid of the human, put in more and more automation, and hopefully that will make our systems better, more optimal, and safer. But what we have found is that even when we take the other route, where we try to automate, and this is something that I presume many of us are tracking these days, self-driving cars which are fully automated, the driver does not really have to do anything. He can even lie back, watch a movie or read a book. What does not get as much press, unfortunately, is the fact that these self-driving cars have had, this table is just a partial list of the accidents that these self-driving cars have got into, and again, just one particular model, Tesla. So when we try to remove people from position of control and rely on automation, the problem really does not go away. So the solution to the human being a villain is not taking away the human. It is to somehow figure out a way to make the human a hero. All of us have seen this movie called Sully. If you have not watched it, I strongly encourage you to watch it. This is one example, now dramatized obviously by Hollywood, but still more or less true to the original spirit of the accident which happened in 2009. A plane taking off out of a very busy airport in New York, flying into a flock of geese, losing both engines and having to decide where to land. The pilot did the one thing he was taught not to do. Let me repeat, he did the one thing which his entire training had told him, do not ever do, and that is dunk the plane in the river. He did it. Everybody was saved. People all went back home without any injury that night. So it is possible that when bad things happen, humans do not have to be only the villains. It is possible for humans very much to be heroes. So what I want to talk about today is how do we ensure that we can make heroes of our plant operators. But let me just try to summarize that very long introduction. What I'm saying is, all of you must be familiar with a picture like this. We have plants, we have closed loop control of various kinds, usually because we put these controls because there are disturbances which enter the system. And the plant perhaps does not desire to have these disturbances propagate onto the product or safety. What I'm saying is that increasingly we are seeing huge amount of disturbances, and the only person who can absorb the variation from the system is going to be the human. So the controller has to be human, and we have to make sure that this controller is really capable. So how do we do that? All of us know the first laws of science. You need to measure, like Lord Kelvin said. So when we started this research program about 10 years ago, we said, let's try to understand human performance. And in order to do that, we need a science-based understanding. Science basically means you require measurements, you need models, and you can then use these models to engineer whatever we desire. Right? So that's what I'm going to be narrating to you over the next, I don't know how much time I have, 30 minutes or so. Let me cut a long story short. I'm sure all of you know that wearable sensors are the norm today. I presume most of you have somewhere within reach a phone. Everything that you're doing is being tracked by companies like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, or whatever. So you're leaving a digital footprint. It's easy to measure what you're doing using this handheld device. I'm not going to walk through the details of it. All I want to say is that today it is possible to measure many things of what a worker is doing in the work site. These things could be explicitly worn, or more likely they are embedded already in the protective gear that they wear. Their helmet could become intelligent or is intelligent. Their belt could be intelligent. The safety gear that they wear could be intelligent, and so on. Is it really that easy? Here's an example. It talks about a person who has to do, or a worker in a particular role who has to do a lot of physical effort. What this person is wearing, you probably will not be able to see it on this image here, so that's a zoomed in portion here on the right. He's wearing a little wearable sensor on his belt, and anytime he assumes during the course of his job a posture like bending, reaching, or twisting his body that may lead to injury, this sensor can detect it. It can warn him with an alarm, and it can also keep track of it and tell his boss, his manager or supervisor, the number of times that this person or all the people doing this job have to adopt these high risk postures during the course of the normal 8 to 10 hour workday. So data can be collected. It can be used to give real time warnings, and it can also be analyzed post hoc, after the fact, offline, to perhaps lead to a better design of the task, of the work. That was an example of physical work. Most of my attention has been on work which is of this nature. We have a chemical plant. We have people who are ensuring safety in a chemical plant, and typically they do it within a control room context. Is it possible to now do the same thing that I showed in that example with the person pushing the load, when a person is not really doing anything physically? Maybe it's just almost a couch potato, but he is applying his mind to the problem. So the first sensor that we started using to understand the person was the eye. We know for a fact that in a control room, much of what enters the mind of the operator is through the eyes, through the interaction the person has with computer screens, which are bringing in data in various forms from all over the plant to the control room. So we started with using the eye as the sensor that we care about. Now there are many sensors out there for getting information about the eye. Again, I will not go into the details. What most of these sensors end up doing is throw out infrared light onto the eye. Again, does not have any health impact on the person. It takes an image of the eye and then translate it into some information. I will talk about that in a minute. Now, this sensor can be deployed as something which is almost non-intrusive. So these computer screens, you can have a little bar at the bottom, which are looking the person's eye. Or it could be that, especially if the person is not going to be sitting in the control room, if it's going to be walking around the plant, we can also give him some special eyewear, like the glasses you see here on the screen, which the person walks and goes about his job as is, and this glasses would collect all the information that we're talking about. So collecting at least eye information is not so difficult anymore. Why do we care about eye? Why did we pick this as the first sensor to go after? Because we know from various other domains that the way we absorb information, the way we extract information, really tells us a lot about what is happening among in our gray cell, in our thinking. What are we thinking? Just a couple of cartoon examples. So if you're driving your normal commute from your hostel to your office, from your home to work, or vice versa, you know the route. You can, since you have done this dozens of times, hundreds of times perhaps, you don't have to apply any conscious thinking. You do this subconsciously. You could be thinking about the conversation you had with a friend, or what you're going to do once you get to your office, or anything else. No thinking required. And if that is the state, people have found, researchers have found, that our eye gaze is in this fashion. We look all over the scenery in front of us through the windshield here in the car. We don't have to focus on the immediate a stretch of road in front of us, and so on. Whereas if I'm driving on a new route for the first time, when I have to look out for cues, is there a pothole in the road? Is there a speed breaker? Is there a sign that I have to look out for to decide where to turn, etc.? Then our eye gaze looks very, very different. This is an example from driving. I picked this because I think all of us can relate to it, but the same thing has been looked at in a variety of other domains, including aviation, surgery, and so on. So we decided to use eye for that reason. So this is the way we do this in a lab kind of context. We have our own test bed where we try to emulate a plant, a chemical plant in our case. We have a mock distributed control system presenting information to a human subject, and we have a eye tracker buried within the monitor that the person does not even have to be aware of, because these lights really don't shine during the operation of the eye tracker. I've just made it like this for you to realize it. So what does the eye tracker do in this situation? So this is a video of what the eye tracker really does. So in this particular case, the user is doing something on the distributed control system DCS screen. He's looking for some variables, monitoring the process as we speak. You will see in a couple of seconds that the plant in this particular case is going to enter into some abnormal condition. The person will then focus his attention trying to figure out, what's gone wrong, why has it gone wrong, what can he do to deal with it. So you notice that this red lights indicate that something is wrong. He goes look at the alarm summary, figures out what variables are deviating, in what way are they deviating, and then after a while, perhaps say I want more information about a particular variable. Perhaps pull a detailed trend like that, look at what the trend is. From that, perhaps make a hypothesis on what has to be done, make that intervention, and then see if the plant is in fact recovering from this abnormal situation. So while the person is doing all these things in real time, we're getting information about what part of the screen is he looking at, how much time is he spending in each of those places. So this is the data that we get out of our eye tracker. Now, what we do, therefore, is we take this screen that he's using for doing his job, break it down into what we call as areas of interest, different places in the computer screen which have information that the operator could potentially use to decide, to gather information, to make up his mind, and then we quantify where he is looking, in what sequence is he extracting information, how long is he spending, how quickly is he moving to something else, etc., into some digital form. Now, this alone provides a lot of insight into what is happening in the mind of operator. Let me just give you a few examples. So in this particular example that I walked you through in that video, the plant was initially normal. And what I'm going to show you in this plot here is on the x-axis time, but on the y-axis, the different areas of interest I show, those different rectangles, which have different pieces of information. So in this particular case study, we have roughly 20 different pieces of information which is available to the operator. And what you find is that initially when the plant is normal, the operator is basically looking all over, just scanning, making sure everything is normal. At this red triangle, this is the point in time when the disturbance enters. And what you would notice that immediately after that, the operator's attention focuses on just 2 or 3 different things, 2 or 3 different AORs. He pretty soon realizes that all the other things which is happening, which is being updated on the screen, really has no great value to him. His attention is focused on this F105, VT01, etc. He's focused on this, figures out what to do, implements it, and then is able to bring the plant back to a safe, normal condition. That happens at this green rectangle shown at the bottom of the screen. After that, for a few more seconds, he continues focusing on those variables, but pretty soon, once the plant is back to normal, he goes back to scanning the entire plant. So if you think of this from undergraduate thermodynamics, we talk about this concept of entropy. What you're seeing basically is during the period when the plant is doing something funny, some disturbance happens, the entropy in the operator's eye gaze has come down drastically. And this indicates that the person is in fact focused on a particular part of the problem. Why is this important? Because as this example shows, if the person is not able to locate the problem, if he doesn't really know even where to focus on to tackle this problem, it means that he is not in a good position to solve the problem. Means that he will fail in whatever task is at hand. So he will not be able to tackle the disturbance and bad things would ensue. So what we are basically saying, therefore, if you think of it again in terms of entropy, is that high entropy in the person's eye gaze during such periods of operation is a bad sign. Okay, it means that he is not on top of the problem. So this can be quantified. We have a number of technical papers where we describe that, and we have done studies with many dozens, several hundred student subjects and some industrial partners as well. And what we find that statistically, that what I just told you as high and low entropy translating to success and failure, in fact, really statistically significantly holds up. Okay. In the interest of time, let me kind of move on. So that was about where he is looking. We also look at how long is the person looking. So that's called the fixation duration. And what we find is that when something unusual, unexpected happens, the person spends a lot more time looking at the screen at a particular piece of information. He is trying to make sense of what is this piece of information telling him. So fixation duration is another indication of the fact that the person is not on top of the situation. What can one do with this kind of information? I'll give you just a sample. So this is some recent work that was not yet published. It's using a data analytic technique called correspondence analysis, where we take this eye gaze data and see through correspondence analysis that if you have a newbie, a person who is perhaps wants to be trained to be an operator, but at this point in time he doesn't have that knowledge, the places where he looks, where he tries to seek information to tackle a task or job, is does not really correlate with the task itself. Whereas, so he could be looking at the wrong thing to achieve something which will not be possible if you were to use that particular handle. On the other hand, an expert has very strong correlations with the things that really matter for that task. Right? So we can talk about association metrics and salience metrics as a way to say whether the person's cause-effect relationship between the handle he has and the effect that he wants to impose on the plant, to reach on the plant. If are they wired correctly? Has he identified what handles to tweak to achieve what end? Yes or no, right? So that can be also done from this kind of data. In the interest of time, let me move on, not talk about gaze anymore. If you look at our eye, it does many things. We are, as scientists, only now learning how powerful this organ called the eye is. But all of us know, this is we know since the times of Mahabharata, that our eye has in the back a pupil. The pupil is a very good sensor. It tells me something about the stress level that's in my mind. Let me again show you with a bunch of examples. So I'm not talking about the black of the eye. I'm talking about something which is kind of invisible, especially with for black-eyed people in India. It can be, it's obviously visible in infrared light. And what you would find is this pupil can contract, can dilate or contract, meaning it can go bigger or smaller. This contraction and dilation, in fact, tell us a lot about the mental state of the person. I'm just going to give you a few examples. So here I have plotted the pupil size as a function of time for this guy who's doing some task and is successful. Notice that the pupil size is changing slowly over the about roughly 40 seconds of this experiment here. It is changing, it's not constant, but it is changing slowly. Why do I say slowly? Because contrast that with this chap here, in this particular occasion, here's a guy who's doing the exact same task, but he never managed to really solve the problem. He never managed to figure out how to overcome it. The task really was ended in a failure. Notice now that his pupil size went through lots of ups and downs, significant ups and downs. So one can again formalize it into math and signal processing and so on. I will not bore you with details. Typically, this kind of information we look at in the frequency domain. And one of the first results we found was that even though I gives you information from 0 to 2 hertz kind of frequency, most of what we care about in terms of cognitive understanding of the operator, we can focus that attention on the 0 to 0.7 hertz kind of range. That was one very strong lesson for us. The second is the amount of power in certain ranges of the spectra give us very good indication whether the person is calm, able to tackle the task at hand, or whether he is stressed and really unsure of how to proceed. right? So pupil being another measure of this. So we have a whole bunch of other things I could talk about with the eye tracker, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. The eye is obviously a very powerful sensor, but it's not the only one. Anytime you're sitting with your friend and then having a discussion, you know that your friend's face tells a story. Mostly this, you can read the face and try to infer what is happening, what is he thinking, what are his emotions, what is his emotional state, just by looking at his face, right? That is something that we can use as a sensor, even when a person is interacting with the computer. So one can do what's called facial expression analysis, and one can figure out whether the person is surprised, confused, interested, disinterested, bored, etc. Another sensor that we can use and we use in our research is electroencephalogram, EEG. It could be a single sensor, a single electrode. It could be a bunch of 10, 12, 14, 16, 100 some electrodes, etc. I will not again bore you with the details. Basically, what EEG is doing is placing electrodes on various parts of the scalp, figuring out the microwatt level electrical activity which is actually happening in our brain, figuring out which portion of the brain is being activated at what strength at any point in time. Typically, we're talking about 500 hertz or so as the frequency at which you get the information. And then we analyze this signal in a variety of bands, a variety of spectrums, and then try to make conclusions. This again is founded in over 70 years of brain research. So that's yet another sensor. The third one is our skin. You may be surprised or you may not be surprised that our skin is a very, very insightful sensor. How is the skin a sensor? I'm sure all of you know that if a person is under great stress, is confused, is struggling, the person will sweat more. This is nothing to do with our weather. It's not like we are in India, we're in a warm climate and therefore we are sweating. Even a person in a cold climate or in a air-conditioned room is going to sweat more when they are doing a lot more mental work, and they're going to sweat less if they are in a calm zone. So if you now therefore pass a very small amount of electricity through the skin, look at the resistance of the skin. Obviously, resistance will drop when you sweat more, and therefore this galvanic skin response is yet another sensor which can provide us information about what's happening in the mind of the person. So this can be deployed as a very simple band that you wear in your hand, sort of like a Fitbit or even a smartwatch these days. So those are sensors. They reveal information. I've given you examples from eye tracking predominantly. Same thing applies from the other sensors I talked about. Now let's go back to this picture that I started this discussion with. I said, in the olden days, this operator had sensors onto the process, which was the temperature that he got from his hand. And the only way the operator could, the owner could make sure that this guy does not fall asleep was to engineer the working conditions. In this particular case, the stool. The title of my presentation was, I'm going to tell you how we could engineer human performance today, not 100 years ago. So how do we engineer performance in today's workplace? So let me talk to that in a minute. We can engineer human performance in at least a few different ways. One is training. Every company does that. They know how to do it, and so they think. What we have found is that analytics, one from the process data that you can get, and the other cognitive sensors I talked about, can reveal us a lot more insights into the quality of training. Okay, I'll just give you some a very simple example from some work we did with some human subjects. Here's a plant. The plant typically tries to keep these variables, the temperature around this level. Occasionally bad things happen, disturbances happen. There's an alarm limit where the operator is supposed to intervene. And we hope that he will ensure that at any point in time, temperature will not go above this line at the top, which is called the shutdown limit. The closer we get to the shutdown limit, the lower the margin of failure, because at that point in time, the plant will shut down, and that's a big negative outcome as far as the company is concerned. So we measure the margin to failure. How close did the person get to before he could bring the temperature back to normal? And how long did it take to do that? So if you plot this for expert operators versus inexperienced operator, what we find is that Both of them variability. What is interesting, however, is the variability for the expert is much, much lower. Okay, and one can do this to extract some reliability information. We have done some work in that area. I will not spend much time talking about it, but what I'm saying is you probably have operator training, you probably have an operator training system if you're in a company. You use that, you figure out whether the person completes the task or no, how long it takes, etc. But one can also do a lot more powerful analytics, even from the measures that you already have. Of course, that by itself is not enough. One can engineer even more powerful things. So I want to use the analogy of maps, Google Maps, for example. If you're driving to a new place, or even when you're doing your day-to-day routine, you probably use the Google Maps to tell you when to turn, which roads to avoid because the traffic is jammed up, etc. So what does the Google Maps do? It does two things for you. It one tells you what's the right SOP, where should you turn, etc. It gives you information in advance. It uses some prediction. It tells you that in the next 100 meters or so, you have to turn right. Okay. It gives you this information in some kind of an advanced sense, and that's very useful. Third thing it does, it gives you this information in form which is very easy to relate. So visualization. Now let's go to how these things extrapolate to the context that we have been working on, chemical plants. If you have much experience with chemical plants, you know that usually you have a screen like this, which is the DCS screen, which tells you where the plant measurements are, what are the current readings, and so on. And you also have this bottom part of the screen. Forget the top part for a minute. You have a log of all the things which are currently abnormal. So that's called the alarm summary, alarm table, alarm log, what have you. This is the only way in most plants today information is passed on to the operator. And expert operators have no problem with it. They take this information, figure out, these are the variables which are in alarm status, and do the things that they need to do. What is possible today, given these advances in technology that I talked about? It is possible to also give a better visualization of these alarms. Instead of giving them a table, we have again done some human subject experiments, and we have found that when information of alarms is given not in a tabular form but in this form, where we have information on which part of the plant is being affected. I called it top left, top right for confidential purposes, but actually it will be things like this tipper section is a problem, this reactor section is a problem, or these alarms relate to the reactor section, and so on. So we can provide information about alarms in a time series sense, right? Just like the Google Maps tells you not just a list of turn right at the next intervention, next intersection. It gives you information in a very oriented graphical display. So this really helps engineer better performance, not only for experts but also for the medium level operator who sometimes struggle, and just having him see information in a more organized way enables better, less variable performance on that one. The third thing we can do using the techniques that we talked about, including digital twins, is to give information about predictions, about what we think is going to happen if the current trajectory that the plant is on continues into the future, or the expected interventions get implemented. One can, in this case, we have shown alarms which will continue to rise in the future, let's say in the next 40 seconds or the next 50 seconds, if the current trajectory continues, right? So this is prediction information. Instead of giving it as a number, we are saying in the same alarm band, give him both historical and prediction information. My purpose in this example is not to tell you that this is the right way to do it. All I'm saying is, if we can engineer our interfaces in a more useful way, human performance can become better. Okay. Just one or two other examples before I stop. I know I'm already over time. These days, there are a lot of sophisticated analytics which are being given to people. Many of these are using very complex technologies like data-driven techniques like deep neural networks and so on. Oftentimes, these are very, very accurate, but none of them is 100% accurate. None of them is accurate all the time. When these are not accurate is the time when operators really get concerned, because they don't know if they should take the information given because they know from their experience that occasionally this thing is going to fail. These things fail, and it's not possible for the operator to make sense of them because these are black box models. So we are doing some research on how do you get these black box models to provide explanations, in a sense, indicate to the operator why is it that this neural network is making this recommendation to the operator, right? This goes under the name of explainable AI. Again, there's a lot of literature there, and this is another way to engineer performance because operators gain more trust in the automation, and therefore they're able to utilize them in a more effective fashion. So let me just wrap up. These are the last couple of slides. We are basically in the last hour or so talked about how do you try to look at human performance as a science. What does a science mean? There are going to be various toolboxes, various tools that one can use. These are out there increasingly so today. What are those building blocks? What are the tools? We have brain-computer interfaces, sensors of various kinds, even manipulators of various kinds. We have developments from a number of other related fields like cyber physical systems, cognitive architectures, explainable AI, social AI, etc., etc. All of this can take into account not just the data which is coming from the plant, but also some data that we can extract from the operator, from the decision maker, to enable a better understanding of the person. One word of concern or warning, especially when we talk about cognitive engineering, just like when we talk about our social data, the data that we have in Facebook, in our LinkedIn, and so on, people sometimes worry about privacy, anonymity, ethics, and so on. The same things apply to some level here, except that now instead of an unknown entity having some information, we're talking about the company having information about their employees. And therefore, this problem of how do you tackle data privacy, how do you tackle anonymity, what are do's and what are clear don'ts are in a sense much easier to manage because there could be an acceptance between the operator or the worker and the company on what is a go and what is clearly a no-go. So what I hope to have conveyed over that hour that we have been talking is that we are now entering a regime where the human is going to be critical. Why? Because the world around us is in a state where volatility is the norm. There is never going to be there's no future, immediate future, where we can assume simple, static, slow developing changes. This means resilience is a must. And as I have shown, I hope to have convinced you with those numerous examples that the human is the one who is going to provide the resilience. The human could, in fact, be a very weak link, and we have seen all those accidents where you put the blame on the human. We have pointed the finger on the human. But as you have seen from today's discussion, that the human could also be our strongest ally in making sure that our systems operate better, they operate safer, and so on. In order to do that, we need to be able to understand humans, we need to engineer humans. In order to engineer humans, obviously we need science, and then we need practical applications. That I talked about the science somewhat at a skin level of depth. I've not get into too much into the details of it, but I hope I've conveyed to you that it's now possible to measure informatics, engineer cognition, and then make systems human aware. There are a number of practical applications, even within the narrow domain of safety. For example, we can ask, is the operator mentally equipped for this particular task that I am going to ask of him? For instance, let me give you just one parting example. I am going to have a person deemed to be the fire marshal. If there's a fire incident in my plant, this person is going to direct people to the right things, to maybe to help evacuate the facility. Is this person mentally equipped to act in that calm, collected fashion when his own life is under the question? That is what I mean by, is the person mentally equipped for the task? In addition to the various examples I talked about. We can ask, in real time, is the person focused on the task? Is he coping with the workload? Is he fresh or is he anxious? Is he fatigued, and so on? And not talked about a number of other technologies like augmented reality, virtual reality, and so on. Professor Maiti and his group in IIT Kharagpur are doing a lot of research in this area, and they also obviously have a major role to play in this work. So before I stop, I just want to take this opportunity to advertise something that I presume, given your interest in this topic, you will find fascinating. So this is the second symposium of our center, the American Express Lab for Data Analytics, Risk and Technology. We have the international symposium. We have top-notch speakers. You would, I'm sure, recognize the second phase that in the top row. Professor Mighty is, we are hoping, going to be one of our keynote lecturers, and we have a number of other eminent faculty from US, Canada, and around the world, working in a variety of settings, all the way from hospital to aviation to supply chains to policy and so on. So if you're interested, registration is free. Go to our website, dart.itm.ac.in, and I strongly encourage you to stop by at least for the keynote talks. They're all in the evening, 5 to 8, 3 days, and you'll get to see not just keynote, but also the research which is going on in IITM in the topics that we talked about. So again, let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any, I'm happy to take any questions now. And of course, if we run out of time, given that I have kind of extended my lecture, feel free to write to me at this email, raj@itm.ac.in, and we can continue the discussion even offline after today's session. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Srinivasan. I think Mom is there.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah, please start.
Thank you, sir. Very, very different perspective of this behavior perspective that we normally struggle in industries. Yes, Sanjana, can we have your announcement, please? So, seeing this popularity of weekend talks, there are many requests to conduct these short-term certificate courses on various topics. So the courses may be online, offline, or hybrid based on the course of the pandemic. So they all are being scheduled, and they will be announced shortly. So just an information for the audience based on the inputs given by you all. So I now hand over the session to our co-moderators for taking up the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So, Professor Srinivasan, thank you for this wonderful presentation on the cognitive ergonomics. So now we have some queries in the chat box. We will take one by one. So the first query is, could we measure the situational awareness of people using sensors?
Yes, I think I'll give you a very brief answer. I think the answer is yes. It depends on how much time we have. I can give you a 20-minute answer if you have the time.
Yes, please,
but
sir.
Yes, it is possible to measure situational awareness using even the sensors we talked about. In fact, many of the things I talked about directly apply to that particular aspect, understanding the situational awareness in real time.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is, what is your opinion about simulating human performance?
So I don't know what the specific aspect that the person was asking. Let me interpret it in one way. Is it possible to interpret how the brain of a person would work in a situation? If I don't know if that's the question, but let me take that up first, and obviously the person who posed the question can clarify if that's not what they were talking about. The answer is yes. So there is a lot of research in the psychology community. These are called cognitive architectures, which we try to mimic how the brain works. So in fact, we have an ongoing research project where we have built a model of given a DCS screen, based on the level of knowledge, where will this person, this computer program, where will it look? So it tries to look at the screen to extract information in exactly the same way that the human operator would. So here I have a computer screen. There's a whole bunch of information there. Not all the information is absorbed by us. When you look at it, we pay attention to only a few things. These things would be different from time to time. Depends on what is happening, what is ongoing in the plant. So what Bharat, one of the students in my research group, has been doing is to build a model called the actor model, again from the cognitive architecture literature, which mimics in a computer program the eye gaze patterns. Where will this person look? How long will he look? What information will he extract? What action would he take once he has obtained that information, and so on. So in a sense, building a brain which behaves similar to a human. This brain obviously is just a computer program. We can train it initially from being a totally novice, has no idea what to do, struggles, it takes all random information, tries various random actions, all the way to a novice, where the person is, where the computer program is now mimicking an expert, looking at the right things, given the current situation, figures out exactly what action to take, implement it, ensures that it has the desired effect on the plant, and so on. So is it possible to mimic the human brain? The answer I would say is yes, definitely.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. So our next question is, when the pilot's helmet, if these are equipped with people sensors, will it help to find out human error part?
Absolutely. There was an accident report which came out a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, I think. It was a Air India Express flight which had crashed. I think it was in Mangalore. I could be wrong with that, but it's a Air India Express flight. They had 2 similar accidents in the last 3 years, both of them having exactly the same kind of a footprint. The question is, why is it that pilots are doing something like that when they know that it's dangerous, which is hazardous? It is possible using sensors to figure out, one, they know that what they're doing is hazardous, right? That's question one. That's answer one, that it is using these sensors, figure out, is the person doing it because it's a slip? He or she does not know that he's committing a mistake. Find that if that's so happening, or the other hand, that the person is knowingly doing something and he knows that it is hazardous, right? So those kinds of detailed insights into the pilot's thinking can be obtained using things like gaze, pupil, and the other things I talked about. I hope that addresses that query.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. So the next question is, how effectively we can measure cognitive workload when the workstations differ?
So that's a good question. So some works are more challenging than others, but one can, with adequate data, adequate samples, figure out what is the typical expected workload. You can, in a sense, come up with a distribution. What is the norm? How much effort is normally felt by the typical operator? It could be a typical expert operator, typical novice operator, typical in-between operator. How much effort do they cognitively face, and then say in this particular instance, how much are they facing, and is there a statistically significant difference, and so on. So it is possible to do that.
Yes. Yes, Ashish?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So our last question is, how to address psychological safety concerns of employees being cognitively monitored?
No, that's a great question, and that's perhaps one of the last things I talked about. The fact that we are measuring something so intimate to the person is a concern, and therefore the responsibility is on, one, the people who are developing these applications, and two, the company which is commissioning this kind of a technology to ensure that they use it only for the right purpose. Now, having said that, let me also tell you something, that all this digital footprint that we are leaving during the course of a normal day. If you have your phone with you, and if it has a GPS sensor like most of our smartphones do, Google or whoever else knows exactly every place that you have been to, not just today, for the last 2 years. We now expect Google to forget it, right? And we can request Google or set settings on Google privacy to ensure that. So that's one way of doing it. The second is, this information does not have to be stored in raw form that can then be misused. It is possible through various averaging techniques to extract only signal and remove everything else which could reveal either the individuality or anything sacred about the person. So it is possible both through the analytics form and through policy.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir, for nice explanation. Now I would like to hand over the session to Ms. Mom Mitra. Thank you, sir.
A lot, sir. I think many more questions are waited. They'll be answered in the due course through mail and all. So I would now request our Professor Obi Krishna to propose a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mom. Professor Rajagopalan, you were the starting of the talk itself. Never normal is the new normal. He has enthused all the audience, including me. So you put your talk in very one sentence so appropriately and ended telling that human is important. So in the world of where people feel artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques, these are all robots. They are going to dominate, and human will be very minimal requirement. You have again warned the whole world that human is always very important. And your smart PPs can generate a lot of data, Professor Maiti. It's a great information to us. Of course, we are also talking on this, but the picture which you have shown, the PP is everywhere. That itself would bring a lot of data for your analytics. It's a big thought for the COE to take it off, along with the help of Professor Rajagopalan. Sir, you talk a lot about eye tracking, and Professor Maiti and his team is also spending huge work on the eye tracking. But now I think you can have your center, our center can have a lot of synergies and coordination to come out with new things in the eye tracker. Recently, the CEO Pichai of Google had said, by tracking eyes, you can predict the heart attacks, and you can predict and take actions. That is what Google is going to come up shortly in eye tracking. A lot of research is going on as you were mentioning Google many times. A lot of research is happening. We are very happy with your talk, especially me. Personally, I felt very happy to see each and every word of your talk. Thank you very much. And a lot of questions will keep coming to you in the mail. Probably you have to take some time to answer, because here I know you can't answer all those questions. And the team of our moderators, Mom and Sinjana, Ashish and Sabik, they are doing a lot of work. You yourself have appreciated the whole team who is running this weekend talks. So it's very successfully happening because of very qualitative talks by professors like you, and a lot of industry specialists are also giving good talks. People are appreciating. In fact, next week we'll have a talk by the president of Aarti Steels, Mr. LTP Narayan, who himself is an expert in not only running the company, but putting the safety initiatives in the right perspective to improve the whole of business through safety eye. Thank you very much. Professor Maiti, I could see your enthused face. You are very happy to see your good friend Mr. Rajagopal and Srinivasan. So if you want to tell anything, you can tell him.
I want to give my heartfelt thanks to Professor Rajagopal and Srinivasan, particularly the eye tracking research point of view, starting from all the eye tracking measures to finally cognitive load, and then showing in real life applications. It's so nice, and it's a commendable work, and I found so many publications also in this area. And as we are also doing that, Sobik is there in this weekend talk today. He is basically working on eye tracking, using eye tracking and NASA TLX, how to measure mental workload, cognitive workload. We know that the level of work you have done, it's really commendable. And your talk was fabulous, I can tell you. So lucidly you explained such a complex topic, and finally with lot many examples, and it not only helps the industry professionals or practitioners. I am telling you, all the research scholars and students who have listened today, even the faculty members, they have got a lot of ideas, a lot of new way of looking into the human performance. Some of the questions, if you see that people are asking about human reliability measurement and human error measurement, yes, yeah, and your lecture will give them to better way of quantifying the human reliability and human error, all those things using those sensors. I cannot express my joy with your for your lecture, and we are extremely thankful to you, Professor Srinivasan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Maiti, and thank you, Professor OBK, for your kind words.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rajgopalan again. Thank you all. We'll see you again in the same time next Friday with Professor LTP Narayan speaking on best practices in the safety implemented in the industry. Actually, you can take away with you how the good practices change the business scenario. He will talk on that. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all audience, participants.
Thank you,
So
sir.
we will meet again in the next week.